In the summer of 1914, Britain's regular army marched to war. Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany referred to the British Expeditionary Force as a contemptible little army, and they soon dubbed themselves the Old Contemptibles. Who were these men? What's the story of their Old Comrades Association formed after the war? And what about John Parr? Was he the first Old Contemptible to be killed on the battlefield? Well, welcome back to another Trench Chat. I'm really pleased this week to be joined by Andrew Thornton, who's a Great War researcher and historian and has worked as a battlefield guide on the Royal British Legion GP 90 event in 2018 and also for Armistice 100. Thanks for joining us, Andrew. Really pleased to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me, Paul. It's a pleasure to speak to you again.
So in terms of your own, I always ask everyone that comes on this the same question. In terms of your own interest in the Great War, where did it start for you?
My interest started when, basically from when I was born. At the time I was born, my dad was in the army. He was stationed with the Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment at Hyde Park Barracks. He was in the Blues and Royals. So I was surrounded from day one by things military. And obviously he came out of the army in 1974, sort of when I was coming up to 3 years old. But that interest never left me. And obviously it developed from playing with toy soldiers and Action Man and things like that. And then as I got into my teenage years, I started reading books about particular subjects. But with regard to the Great War, the catalyst for me, I'd had a passing interest in it. But the first time I went on a battlefield tour, our school battlefield tour when I lived in the Northeast in February 1988 was the real kickstarter for me to concentrate my interests on researching aspects of the Great War, particularly the experiences of those who served on the Western Front in particular.
So in terms of your sort of more recent research, you've done a lot of stuff on the Old Contemptibles, haven't you?
Yeah, I have, yes. Well, with regard to that, my interest in the Old Contemptibles came back again from my dad. When I was at school, it was around about 1984 when it was the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the Great War, and obviously there were a few events and programs on the television regarding the Old Contemptibles and the original BEF in 1914. And he said, we happened to be watching one of those. I think it might have been the program that was shown on BBC Two. Was it Very Exceptional Soldiers? I can't remember.
Very Exceptional Soldiers, yeah, when they took the last veterans back.
That's the one, yes. Well, I can remember watching that vaguely, and I can remember my dad saying how good the old army, as he called them, were. I mean, when he was in the army, he used to have an old contemptible come and visit the Corporal of Horse's mess at Knightsbridge, a chap called Bert Turp, who was in the Royal Dragoons, which my dad had been in before they amalgamated to become the Blues and Royals. And Bert used to come and seek out the ex-Royal Dragoons and sort of ask them to buy him a pint and things like that. But he was always very impressed with the Old Contemptibles and how, obviously, I became interested in that. And from that, I started reading various books like David Ascoli's Mons, Tim Carew's books, Anthony Farrar-Hockley's book about First Deep. I can remember in 1988 when Lynn MacDonald's book 1914 came out, and what I was particularly struck with that was her use of accounts, which I obviously later found out were a mixture of near contemporary and also later interviews, and finding out about the experiences of those who served in France and Flanders in 1914 and what they'd seen and what they remembered.
And in terms of when we talk about Old Contemptibles, I mean, some people think that applies to every soldier that was in the Great War, but it's a very specific group, isn't it?
Absolutely, yes. To be an Old Contemptible, you had to have served with the British Expeditionary Force between the date of qualification was 5th of August to midnight 22nd, 23rd of November 1914. But to have also qualified for the 1914 Star. But to be regarded as a true Old Contemptible, you had to be eligible to receive the clasp to be worn on the ribbon of the 1914 Star, which had those qualification dates on it. And to give you some idea of the size of the BEF between August and the end of November 1914, there was something like 348,000 1914 stars issued at the end of the war. And I think there's an estimate, although nobody's quite certain, that there were 150,000 or so clasps claimed for in the years subsequent to that, when the clasps were awarded after they'd decided that they needed some distinction to show those people who'd been in the original BEF on the medal.
So if you were a baseballer at Rouen, baking the bread to be sent up to the front line so Private Smith could eat it at Bois Grenier, you couldn't get into the Old Contemptibles Association then if you didn't have the clasp.
Actually, Paul, that's not quite true.
Ah.
From my that's the interesting thing from my research, because I mean, obviously, I've been interested in the Old Contemptibles for a long time, but I've been obviously doing a lot of research in the past few years about the Old Contemptibles Association, because although people have heard of the Chums and the Old Contemptibles Association, there's a lot that the little that was available I've found from doing my research is very inaccurate. With regard to sort of who was a chum, the association were very specific in that you could only join the association if you were in possession of the clasp to your 1914 star. But I'm currently compiling a nominal roll of chums from the association based on information recorded and branch nominal rolls in the magazine of the association, which was called the Old Contemptible, and newspaper reports, and looking at individuals and finding out who they were, what branches they were in, and what units they served with in 1914. There were quite a few chums who were members of the association who either didn't qualify for the clasp, but for some reason it was ignored. I've even found chums who had an application for a clasp refused, but they still happen to be members of a particular branch. And found some even more interesting ones of chums who didn't even qualify for a 1914 star in any way, shape, or form. One that springs to mind is there's a nominal roll of the Aldershot branch from 1936 that I have, that was printed in the Old Contemptible. And one of the chums was a sailor on HMS Birmingham, and of course the Royal Navy at sea didn't qualify for the 1914 star. It was only the land-based element that served with the Royal Naval Division and the various other components that served around Dunkirk and Ostend in 1914 that qualified for the 1914 star.
And the BEF itself was quite an interesting spread of units, really, wasn't it? It wasn't just the regular army.
No. I mean, that's another thing I've found that's sort of been amplified by my research into the nominal roll. I've found all sorts of interesting characters. The public perception of Old Contemptibles is that, and what you usually sort of see in the media is, particularly in August 19th, that the BEF were either very young regular soldiers or sort of long in the tooth reservists who'd all uniformly served in South Africa during the Boer War, although to do that you would have to be on the Section D reserve, because you would have your 12 years as a regular, either with the colours and the reserve, would have expired even for some of the younger soldiers who've been in South Africa, say 1901, 1902, by the time 1914 happened. But there are special reservists and also civilians in uniform, for want of a better phrase, serving in August 1914, particularly in the support units such as the Army Service Corps. There were a lot of drivers who were either on the Special Reserve or even had enlisted sort of within days of war being declared, who within a week of being in uniform, because they could drive a lorry, found themselves in France serving with ammunition parks and ammunition columns and supply columns, various logistic units behind the lines. There's one chap who I can think of, a chap called Walter Fripp, who was a member of the Coventry branch of the association, and he actually enlisted at Avonmouth, and on the day he enlisted, he was on a ship to France, and then landed and was driving around in his lorry, driving around various places. So there's quite a mixture of people, even that early stage of the war. But later on, obviously, you have the territorial force coming in, You have more special reservists being drafted over to replace casualties. Even amongst the territorial force soldiers, there were individuals who'd enlisted after war had declared, so they had only been in uniform a matter of weeks. There was obviously the Royal Naval Division who served Antwerp, and they were a mixture of regular Royal Navy stokers, which they had a surplus of, Royal Fleet reservists, Royal Naval Volunteer reservists, and also Kitchener volunteers who'd enlisted for particular infantry regiments but had been drafted to the RNVR to make up the battalions that made up the Royal Naval Division. I've even found two Americans who were serving with the BEF in 1914 that I'm aware of, individual Australians and New Zealanders and Canadians. And of course, part of the BEF in 1914 and can be classed equally as Old Contemptibles, of course, were the thousands of soldiers who served in the Indian Corps, who landed in southern France from September 1914 and then moved north to take part in fighting around Neuve-Chapelle and Ypres in October and November 1914 as well. So it was a huge sort of diverse body of people who served in France during those dates. And I don't think that's always sort of considered sometimes.
No, absolutely. No, the 1914 Star was instituted in 1917, wasn't it?
Yes.
So when did sort of the idea of the Old Contemptibles Association come about? Was it after that?
Well, the Old Contemptibles Association that we know of, which has the Chums, was instigated by a chap called Captain John Patrick Danny, who himself is quite an interesting character because I did some research about him because nobody seemed to sort of know where he came from. And quite by chance, I stumbled upon this reference on an American genealogy site and got in contact with one of his, a relative of Captain Danny's sister, and found out that he was born Rezo Engel in Hungary in 1873. And he'd actually served for 12 years with the Royal Horse Artillery before the war, had come to the end of his service, was working as the secretary for the National Seamen's and Firemen Union. And then when war was declared, he re-enlisted and joined the Royal Field Artillery and was sent out to France with 8th Division in November 1914. But what he did on the 25th of June 1925 is he and 6 other Old Contemptibles who held the 1914 Star with clasp decided to have a meeting to set up an association, which then grew into an association that had 240 branches throughout the world. It wasn't the first type of group that existed. There was a previous incarnation of an Old Contemptibles Association that had been founded in 1919, and there were branches that I know of in London, Newcastle, Glasgow, and Manchester, but that disappeared in 1921 because it was subsumed by the British Legion. But there were also other groups as well, which weren't part of the Old Contemptibles Association, but had sort of similar membership criteria that were based in Northern Ireland. There were the Old Contemptibles Association of Wales. There was the Bristol Mons Star Association, Mons Star Club rather. And also there was one for employees of the Great Western Railway as well, which also included holders of the 1914-15 Star. But as far as the Old Contemptibles Association I'm researching, they started in 1925, and they continued. The last element of that association finally closed in August 1994, when the London and South East Area Association finally closed down. So it lasted well over 70 years, almost over 70 years. Like I say, there were branches all across the world. There were 2 in the United States, 10 in Canada, 5 in Australia, 4 in New Zealand, and there were chums in all over the place. So, and the membership from my research, the total membership during that period was between 40 to 45,000 chums between 1925 and 1994. So it's quite a fairly big organisation.
And they issued a little, well, the most common one I think is the bronze badge, isn't it?
That's right. Yes. Yeah, well, the badges themselves are quite an interesting sort of artifact because anybody who has an Old Contemptibles Association badge will notice on the back of it is stamped an individual number. And during the course of my research, I've been able to find sort of documents that have almost like a Rosetta Stone that have unlocked the sequence of how these were issued. And there were well over 50,000 of these badges issued between 1926, when they first started being given to chums, and 1975. Although it's very difficult to actually find definite information to identify an individual chum from that badge. Each one was individual, and at the time, the headquarters of the association had an overall role, so they knew who they'd sent the badge to. If it was lost, it had to be reported to the association. The badge at all times was the property of the association, so they were very keen to get it back if a chum had left a particular branch. And also in the rules of the association, there was a section to say that the badge could be retained by members of a chum's family if he died, but in no circumstances should it ever be worn again other than by the chum it belonged to. So the badges themselves have quite an interesting story as well. But you see a lot of those about on eBay and various other things. But as there were over 50,000 issued, that's not surprising, really.
No, it'd be good to find that roll with them all listed in.
I know out of the 50,000 that were issued, I've only got information on about 280 individuals and matched their badge number with their individual records. So I've got quite a way to go on that.
And the other thing you often see, I mean, I've seen them in cemeteries over the years, is that sort of like a grave marker with the same badge of the Old Contemptibles.
That's right. Yeah, the memorial plaques. I mean, again, they're quite an interesting. There's an interesting story behind those, which I've been researching. The idea of having a marker is basically because a lot of the chums were in straitened circumstances and couldn't afford a headstone. So the associations had an idea that, as well as marking the grave of one of their departed chums, that it would also serve as a headstone for them. And there were various sort of plans put in place. But by 1935, the Coventry branch had designed a memorial plaque, which the grave marks are known as, which was just a plain version of the badge on a stake. And they had a number produced, which were then made available, and Coventry branch went around the cemeteries around the area and placed them on the graves of chums. And then they sent others off to other branches around the country. And then later on, the design of the plaque changed, and again, those were used up until 1975. That's the last reference I've got of one being placed on a grave. Again, I've found references to individual ones. There's about 130 that I've got details of so far. But unfortunately, some of these plaques have been removed from graves and either been stolen or sold for scrap. But occasionally, some of them end up on auction sites. I mean, earlier this year, there were two that appeared on eBay, for example, and they usually said that described as they were sort of given to the families, and that's not true because they're actually placed on the graves, and the chums had obviously paid for them to be placed on the graves, and there was usually a ceremony involved when they were officially placed on the graves and things like that. So I don't know, it's something that I'm sort of quite passionate of trying to get the ones that survive in situ being recorded in some way. And I know there's people who argue that would encourage their theft for either the value of the metal or as for collectors. But at the same time, if you don't know where they are, you don't know they're stolen, and you don't know they exist until they actually end up on auction sites and things like that. It's another sort of physical reminder of the chums, which I think needs to be more well known about, and what the actual memorial plaques actually stand for as well.
Yeah, and it'd be a good way of getting, I think, local communities to appreciate the history they've got on their doorstep like that.
Absolutely, Paul, because there's so many reminders of the chums about. I mean, if you go into churches in any sort of large city or town, you might notice that there's a branch standard laid up there, or even a memorial inside a church to mark that chums worshipped at the church, or wanted to set the memorial up there. In Birmingham, for example, we actually have a living memorial to the chums, to the Birmingham branch, and that's the Old Contemptibles pub, which is where the Birmingham branch had their headquarters for most of the time during their existence. For they were formed in 1928, and in 1953, Mittles and Butler's Brewery decided to rename the pub, which was called the Albion Hotel, the Old Contemptibles, in their honour. And the name's been retained. And if you go into the pub, as I know you have many times, and I have many times, because I live in Birmingham, there are still some reminders of the Birmingham branch on the walls that you can see, some photographs and little clippings and things like that. So it's nice that there's something there tangible that you can sort of remember them in a situation that they thoroughly enjoyed themselves, having a pint of beer and a natter.
Yeah, it's a very good place, isn't it, for a Great War enthusiast to meet up?
Yeah.
So in terms of what you've been researching, you've started to publish some of this information, haven't you?
I have, yeah. It started off with a Facebook page, which I originally set up in 2013, just putting little snippets that I've been sort of recording and stowing away sort of many years previously. And then I sort of shifted the emphasis from trying to retell the events of 1914 to look at the Old Contemptibles Association as well. And that's been quite interesting for me, because I've been very fortunate that I've had a lot of relatives of chums share information with me that I wouldn't have known about otherwise. They've shared photographs. I've been very fortunate that I was contacted by the grandson of one particular chum who's quite well known for anybody who's seen the BBC Great War documentary from 1964, a chap called John Willis Palmer, Pedlar Palmer, who was in the Walthamstow branch. His grandson, Gary, very kindly forwarded me the original branch records of the Walthamstow branch and I've been allowed to borrow them for a while, so to help me with my research. And it's a pleasure to be able to share this information and with other people, and also help relatives of chums find out a little bit more information about their grandfathers, great grandfathers, and keep the memory of the chums green. And it's it's a good way to use social media.
Absolutely, because there must be, like the records of the Walthamstow branch, there must be lots of this material sitting in people's attics and drawers and stuff that really could do with coming out and to increase our understanding of the Old Contemptibles.
Absolutely. I mean, there are a few branch records held in archives all over the country. And last year, when I went on a family holiday to Jersey, I sneakily booked a couple of hours at Jersey Archive to look at the Jersey branch records. And they're fantastic to look at, because they've got scrapbooks and they've got the membership books and everything else. Because there's no sort of central focal point for the association, the information sort of like say scattered about in various archives in the Imperial War Museum, various local archive offices and record offices, and a lot still held by family members as well, and who are not necessarily aware of how important these little pieces of paper and things are to researchers. It's fantastic primary source information, and it's so nice to be privileged that when somebody gets in contact with me on my Facebook page and say, I've got my granddad's badge and here's a couple of photographs of him and the various other bits of paper, and it's a great privilege to see these things and then be able to help them to tell the story of that particular chum. And it's it's very gratifying for me to be in a position to be able to do that.
Yeah, and we'll put some links on the Old Frontline website to your Facebook group so that people can find you, because it could be that some people listening to this have got some information that could be of interest to you.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm always searching for anything to do with the Old Contemptibles Association or chums. Any sort of little scrap of information is always of interest to me, and it could sort of be the key to unlocking some other element of the story that I'm not aware about yet, because although I've done quite a lot of research, I'm by no means finished. I mean, I'm working on a nominal roll of chums at the moment, and like I say, I estimate there's between 40 and 45,000 chums who are members of the association between 1925 and 1994. I've only got and confirmed the details of getting on for 8,000 so far. So that's just a drop in the ocean, and there's so much information that I know is out there that I haven't got to look at yet. Or obviously, I can't do it at the moment because of the situation we're in. But I know that in the future, when I can do, I'll be going down to London to go to the British Library to look at the copies of the Old Contemptible that they have there, which I haven't had access to, and trying to get to other archives to see what information they have as well, just to help build up a better picture of the chums and their lives and the stories as well.
So very much an evolving project then.
Yes, it is very much so. It's growing all the time. I'm always, to the despair of my wife, I'm probably doing something chums related every day. There's always something that comes up, Paul, as you know.
Well, it's one of the joys of this, we've said it many times, it never ends, and there's always a fresh page and a new story and another name, and I think that's great, really.
Yeah, it is. Like I say, it's a privilege to be able to do this, and it's a privilege that so many people have helped me sort of with information and shared information with me. I'm just sort of trying to tell the story, and I hope that what I post on my Facebook page, or what the little snippets I put on Twitter, or the little articles I put on my blog, are of use to people, and help with their research as well, because that's the whole point of it. There's no point to doing research and hiding it away. You've got to share it with people, and you've got, because it could help them.
Now, in terms of individual Old Contemptibles, there's several 100,000 of them, but there's one that is of interest to a lot of people who travel to the battlefield to the First World War, or have even a passing interest to it, and that is what is believed to be the first British Western Front casualty in action of the Great War, John Parr. But like a lot of things with the Great War, what we think we know isn't always what actually happened.
Yes. Yeah. John Parr's story is very interesting. I mean, obviously, the version of the story that we know now, or is repeated constantly now, is that he was killed on the evening of the 21st of August 1914 while on the bicycle with a friend. Apparently, he was a fellow soldier on a bicycle, and he was on a reconnaissance patrol. But there's a lot of inconsistencies with that story, and I'm not the first one to do this by any means, questioning sort of like the veracity of the story. But for my own personal sort of curiosity, I decided, instead of trying to develop yet another theory about how he was killed on the 21st of August, was to try and do some research to find out the origins of the story of why people believe he was killed on the 21st of August, and how the story evolved, and all the background information to it. I've written about it in my blog, and it's quite a complicated, sort of convoluted story. But pretty much before 1976, when Rose Coombs published her first edition of Before Endeavours Fade, John Parr's name wasn't really on the radar of anybody in particular who had an interest in the Great War, or his story wasn't known generally anyway. And in the first edition of that book, obviously Rose had been to the battlefields many times, and she'd noticed that Private Parr was recorded in Soldiers Died of the Great War and in other official documents as having been killed on the 21st of August 1914. Obviously, when she'd visited the cemetery during the 1970s, the headstone at St Symphorien Cemetery had 23rd of August on it. So she did a bit of investigation, and by the time the fourth edition of her book came out in 1983, the story developed that he'd gone riding off on his bicycle on the evening of the 21st of August and had been killed. And based on that information, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission had altered his headstone date to the 21st of August. But in fact, the 21st of August date had been on his headstone when it was first erected in the early 1920s, when they laid out the cemetery when the Imperial War Graves Commission took over the cemetery. And the information, that date, had actually come from what was recorded on his records at the Infantry Records Office at Hounslow. Although, again, if you refer to Private Parr's original service record or what remains of it, there are discrepancies of the dates on there. So what I've been able to determine is that the date that was on his headstone originally, which was the 21st of August, didn't come from German sources, but most likely came from British sources from the Infantry Record Office. And again, I'll go into more detail on my blog post regarding Private Parr. But for many years, the 21st of August date was on his headstone, up until 1963, when a chap called William Beard got in contact with the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Unfortunately, his correspondence isn't preserved, but based on what he told them, they altered the date on his headstone to the 23rd of August. Now, William Beard served with the 4th Battalion, the Middlesex Regiment, in 1914, and he was a battalion scout. And obviously, what he'd told the Commonwealth War Graves Commission had given them enough cause to notice that the date was probably incorrect and to alter it back to the 23rd of August. Where Rose Coombs comes in, and again where William Beard reappears, is much later in the story, because in 1979 and 1980 she accompanied old comrades of the Middlesex Regiment back to Mons, and she'd done a research about Private Parr and noticed the difference between the date recorded in Soldiers Died of the Great War and also what was on his headstone at the time. And she also came across the story of 2 cyclists being sent off on the morning of the 22nd of August to get in contact with outposts that had been set out in front of the battalion the night before. So from that story of the cyclists being sent out on the 22nd of August to get in contact with outposts, it's suddenly the story changed to Private Parr riding out on his bike on the evening of the 21st of August and being killed. Apparently, William Beard had also told this story, been talking to Dickie Smith, who I know you knew, Paul, about what had happened during the war, because he went on a pilgrimage in 1972 to Mons, one that was filmed by the BBC, as it happens. And based on what Beard had told Dickie Smith, he wrote in support of the to have the date changed to the 21st of August. So basically, from that point in the early 80s, the story of Private Parr being killed originally started off him being on his own on the bicycle. Later on, people found out a bit more about William Beard and his testimony, and then Private Parr is now as himself and Private Beard on the bikes together. Private Beard being waved away to be told to inform them that by Private Parr while he's engaging the enemy before he was shot. And there's so many inconsistencies in the story, and like I say, I'll go into it in great detail in my blog post. It's quite difficult to explain in a straightforward, easy way. But basically, I don't personally believe that Private Parr was the first soldier killed, and there's been the story about how he was killed is a sort of a manipulation of known facts, and then has been embellished subsequently.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because you know there were men on bikes, there were reconnaissance patrols like that. You know, that's part of what the army did at that time. But when you look at where they were and how far away the enemy was, you know, if that was the case, who killed him? I mean, I know the late John Cooksey did some research on that and came up with the idea of it being friendly fire, but that sort of takes you down yet another avenue, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, that's the thing. People have thought that there've been theories added to support the date of death, but I think you need to go further back and you need to look at the source evidence and things like that. And like obviously there's friendly fire and I mean at the time the official commemorations in August 2014. I've got the booklet that was for the ceremony that was held at Saint-Symphorien, and there's a passage about Private Parr, and it mentions that he was a member of a specific group of scouts that had been organised by 8th Infantry Brigade. There's absolutely no evidence for that on his service record or anything else recorded to support that statement. If you look at Private Parr's record, there's no information recorded on there to say that he qualified as a scout. Even William
It would
Beard
be on there, wouldn't it? Because he was it was a proficiency award for which he'd have had more pay.
Absolutely, yeah. It's fundamental details like this that need to be looked at, and like I say, I've written about it in my blog, and it's quite a long article because I've sort of tried to trace the sort of evolution of the story and everything else. But there's another soldier as well who's commemorated by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, a Private Bradshaw, who's in the 4th Battalion Royal Fusiliers. He's also recorded by the Commission as having been killed on the 21st of August 1914. But his grave was moved in the 60s from Mazières, where he was originally buried, over to Cement House Cemetery in Ypres. And because he's not on the Mons battlefield, even though his date of death is exactly the same as Private Parr's, he's not on anybody's radar. Yet, if you apply the same reasoning has been applied with the case of Private Parr, then surely Private Bradshaw would also be one of the first, a first soldier who was killed by enemy action. The information is quite plainly incorrect because it said it's recorded in several sources that he died as a prisoner of war in enemy hands of wounds, and he was most likely mortally wounded around the canal around Nijmegen on the 23rd of August. These things happen, a slip of the pen, lack of information. There's various reasons that can be attributed to these mistakes. I mean, it's easy for us in the with all our internet and easy access to records and things like that we can spot mistakes and things like that. But for a clerk in a record office who's dealing with thousands of files with information coming in at all times, trying to notify next of kin of soldiers who are missing or are killed, or trying to find out what had happened to them in the first place. We need to understand what it was like for them during the Great War, trying to administer the records. So it's quite easy that it's quite understandable that these mistakes happen. I mean, they're happening today, aren't they, with Excel spreadsheets? But that's another thing entirely.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I suppose the mystery as well is if he did die so far away, on that border with France, how did he end up in Saint-Symphorien Cemetery? Who buried him there? There's no record to indicate that it's a concentration burial from the locations that are supposedly connected to him. It's a curious one.
It is a very curious one. I mean, what I did to try and establish I had an idea that the data come from the records office at Hounslow, but to be able to confirm it, what I did was I looked at the burial returns from the Imperial War Graves Commission, which are available on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission website now, and compared the dates of death recorded on those with the information that was recorded on the Register of Soldiers' Effects and any surviving service records for the soldiers who were buried in the same row as Private Parr. And what I found was that the dates of death were entered by the Imperial War Graves Commission staff because there wasn't any information on any markers that had been provided by the Germans at the time. They were all entered subsequently when they were doing the grave registration in 1921, I think it was. And you'll also notice on some of the soldiers who are buried in the same row as Private Parr, there's a soldier from the Middlesex Regiment. I think his date of death is recorded as the 4th of November, 1914. And his records survive. And that's actually the date that information had been received via the American embassy from the Germans that he died. Not necessarily the date on when he died, but when the information was received. And similarly, there's a soldier from the 2nd Battalion Royal Irish Regiment who originally was recorded to have died on the 19th of October 1914. And what I found was that there was a soldier with the same name from the same battalion who was taken prisoner at Le Filly on that date. And the record office at Cork had confused the two soldiers, so had sent the information to the Imperial War Graves Commission that he died on the 19th of October. Then it was subsequently found that that was incorrect and the error was corrected, and is now recorded as having died on the 23rd of August. So, like I say, it's you have to have a look at the source information to be able to sort of get try and get a better understanding. But like I say, how the story about Private Parr has developed now bears absolutely no relation to what little factual paper evidence there is to support the claims that are made about him now.
No, and I think it's the temptation of that story, isn't it? Really, knowing that there he is, buried opposite Trooper Ellison, killed on the last day of the war, and they're separated by a few feet of ground, and it's the first and the last.
Yeah, I think the sort of like the emotional need to have a symbolic first and last fatality, and like you say, mirroring each other within yards. It's almost a similar situation to the memorials at Casto, where you got like obviously the 4th Dragoon Guards Memorial, and then across the road you got the one to the 116th Battalion of the CEF, again separated by a matter of yards. It's sort of like the emotional need to have sort of symbols on the battlefield is overriding sort of perhaps the need to look at cold hard facts, and to be honest with you, to try and be fair to these soldiers, instead of being sort of making them as symbols, try and tell their stories as honestly as you possibly can.
Absolutely, and I think it just shows that, you know, as we often say, really, it is at the last page of the Great War's history. You know, we'll never see it written, certainly not in our lifetime, and probably not in a few lifetimes, because there's so much more for us to know and understand.
Absolutely. I mean, you never stop learning, and you never stop finding something that makes you question what you thought that you knew before. I mean, like doing the research I've been doing about the Old Contemptibles, my understanding of who like the soldiers who served in the BEF in 1914 has increased and has changed considerably from what I thought I knew, basically by just going back to their surviving details of the service, finding out where they came from, what they worked as before the war, before they joined up, and also the stories about what happened to them after the war as well, when they, after they left the army, and some of the interesting stories that you find out about people's lives afterwards. It's quite easy. Like finding out about soldiers who survived the Great War is very difficult in comparison with trying to find information about those who sadly didn't survive. I mean, we're very fortunate in having all the resources of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission to refer to if we're looking for those who died. But for those who survived, it's a far more difficult process. And obviously, I'll try not to do it myself as much as I can. But obviously, with regard to those who died and those who survived, it's so easy to project our modern way of thinking onto the way that they thought. And it's like I say, it's not fair to them to do that. You have to try and if you can, use their own words and try and let them speak for themselves, rather than you put their experiences through your voice and your sort of understanding.
Absolutely, I think it's why it's researching primary sources is such an important thing.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Well, Andrew, thank you for telling us about your fantastic bit of research there in both the Old Contemptibles Association and also Parr himself. We'll put a link to your Facebook page and also your article about the research that you've done into John Parr.
Yeah, the article is probably far more articulate than me doing a blog, doing a podcast.
No, not at all. No, it's fascinating to hear it, and I'm sure a lot of people would like to read all the detail that's in there. So, thanks for your time, Andrew. It's been fascinating chatting to you, and hopefully we'll get you back again sometime to chat a bit more.
Thank you very much, Paul. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks. Cheers, Andrew. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.